Assalamu alaikum. My name is Shamim Hossain. I am a Bangladeshi-born, New York-raised PhD student in Islamic Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. Of like Muslim empire hasn't worked. We aren't good enough, so we need to sort of engage in this Muslim apologetic discourse. From an Islamic worldview, it called back to certain rights within both the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire of how land rights worked. And it basically disqualified British rule on an Islamic basis. I think very often when we think about history repeating itself, we think about the events that are bad or that have negative consequences. But we also need to remember that history repeats itself in people overcoming those negative circumstances and overcoming those negative consequences.
And maybe we'll use this as our intro to the episode, right?
Right.
So for those of you watching, welcome everyone to episode 2 of the Journey podcast. Today we have with us Shamim Hussain. Shamim has his Islamic Studies degree from his master's from Columbia University and now pursuing his PhD in UNC Chapel Hill.
That's right.
So Shamim, assalamu alaikum.
Welcome to the podcast. Salam.
I need this for the intro.
That's right. That's right. I got you covered.
Awesome.
We're starting now. This is the beginning of the podcast. Yeah. It's definitely one of the biggest shifts I've had, like going into NC, moving from New York to North Carolina. I think I think like culturally it's like quite different.
Yeah.
I think North Carolina is a lot slower. Obviously it's the South and like, but there are like certain New York contexts that I think like still get lost. I notice like sometimes when people like, it's a big car culture over there naturally because it's the South.
Yeah.
But like sometimes I see people, they don't lock their cars when they leave, bro.
Yeah.
And it's a big like New York thing of like, no, you have to lock your car, make sure that it's like secure, or it will get broken into.
Dude, like I always tell the same exact story to everybody. It's like a culture shock, especially if you grew up in New York City. You're so accustomed to like looking over your shoulder.
Yeah.
Where like when I was working in Jersey, I think we went to like Monroe, Jersey or something like that. It's like a little bit further out there. And we went to a park after work to go play ball with one of my friends.
Yeah.
And then so we go park up. We have our phones, our keys, everything. We leave it on the side of the court. And he's like, this court's not all right. Let's go play on that other court over there, right? And then he's just walking there. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, you can't just leave your phone and wallet and car keys on the floor on a basketball court in a park. Like,
it's gonna
just walk away.
It's gonna be gone.
Crazy?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, so
100%.
Like I mean, growing up in New York City, we would just like maybe not bring anything that you don't absolutely need, and if you do, you have it like huddled up, and then like you have like a card like sitting by it.
I used to remember I wouldn't even leave my phone like in my car out. Like I would like put it stowed away.
Yeah,
like because I mean. So I think like there is like that culture shock is definitely real when you move down south.
It builds character.
Yeah, that's right. And sort of like a deep sense of paranoia. I think it builds like a deep, non-relenting sense of paranoia.
Like, people don't have to live like this.
Yeah,
like this
that's
is
right.
not a thing. Like...
That's right. That's right. Though I will say when I moved down to Durham, we had like a guy come in and do some yard work for us. We were asking about the neighborhood, like my wife and I. And he did say like, okay, avoid this street because one time he was saying like he was driving there and he got all 4 wheels stolen while he was in the car, bro. Like NASCAR quick.
Yeah, I was
like
gonna say.
On some like real sort of like immediate, like he blinked and it was gone sort of deal. Which I mean, I guess like you got your pros and cons, I guess.
I feel like you need some more details on that story. Like, how are you in the car? Like,
I remember the name. I actually forgot the name of the street. So, all I know is I'm not driving into certain areas of Durham late at night.
If you ever lose your tires at a certain street, you'll be reminded.
That's right. That's right. I'll be like, I should have remembered.
Yeah.
But yeah, man. I think the last time I saw you was a while ago, bro. I think I feel like when we were like hooping in Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah. In the piers, we played ball there. Yeah. We might have seen each other, and that was typically during the summertime. But I think prior to that, like when we'd actually like sit down and like catch up and have conversations was those chai nights. Yeah, your brother and everybody and Umar and
my brother and that was definitely like before. I think it was like 2018, 2019, something like that.
It's been a while.
Yeah, that was before I even started the Islamic Studies stuff, man. Like I was I was still working in the nonprofit sector, I think,
Yeah.
around like 2017, 2018.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember, I don't know if you remember this, like, we once had, like, dinner, it was you, me, and your brother, maybe there was somebody else, I forget, but, it was, like, somewhere in downtown Brooklyn,
Yeah, that sounds
uh,
about right.
uh, uh,
I'm trying to remember, but yeah, I
but
think
that
that
was,
that was a while ago. That was a while
yeah,
ago.
yeah.
Yeah, man, that was back when I could afford to go out for dinner. The PhD life does not pay well. I'll say that much.
It's not all glitz and glamour.
It's very little glitz, very little glamour. A lot of eye strain and books, like a lot of,
Yeah, it's
um
the grind, you're
that's
in the
right. That's right. It's a
yeah,
different kind of grind. I
yeah,
think like um it is I think in that respect I fell into the PhD a little bit. I was more accustomed to that sort of thing because I think growing up in New York also you're used to sort of hustling and grinding and
yeah,
sort of a lot of like restless nights and sleepless nights and
yeah.
working at it, which is basically what a PhD is. Um,
So, like, I'd love to learn more about that. So, what does a PhD in, let's say, religious studies or Islamic studies or history kind of look like? What is that kind of
yeah, totally.
day to
I mean,
day?
I think it varies, right? I think you know, a lot of these disciplines kind of use the same tools, but it's a question of what you're trying to get out of it.
Right.
So I am working in a religious studies department, though a lot of my work is focused, a lot of my training was in history, and a lot of my work focuses kind of on that, uses more methodologies that are history specific.
Hmm.
Uh, but a religious studies department typically has a little bit more flexibility in terms of what those methodologies could be. So, for example, if you're doing historical work in a history department, you're very often tied to archives, right? And I think like there's a lot of conversation within the history space about what that looks like, especially recently. But largely speaking, if you don't have like a textual source or an archival source or something like that, it's very hard to do historical work because the discipline is a lot of like, well, where's the proof? Where's the source? Where's the archive? Whereas in religious studies, the discipline is a lot more broad. You could be working on philosophy. You could be working on ethnography. Ethnography is kind of a anthropological study of like of folks. You could be working on history, or you could be working on a lot of different things. And so for me, I think religious studies offers a little bit more flexibility in terms of what I want to do, um, which is useful because I think that so I'm studying Islam in Bengal and Islam in South Asia. Um, a lot of that South Asian archive lies in London, particularly because it's the colonial archive. So when the British left, they took a lot of that stuff with them, and it's located there and things like that. Um, the work that I'm doing focuses between around like I'm estimating, but like basically 1750 to around 1820, 1830.
Interesting.
So right after colonial presence started in Bengal, and basically right before um the Sepoy Rebellion. The Sepoy Rebellion, for those who don't know, was a rebellion that happened amongst the Sepoys or Sipahis in India, in colonial India, in 1857. It's often called a mutiny. It's often called a rebellion. It's called a lot of different things. But this is kind of a watershed moment in colonial Indian history where you can draw a direct line from the Sipahi Rebellion to independence in 1947. It's kind of the first fissures in sort of the colonial state in India. But yeah, so my work ends right before that and starts basically around 1757, which is when the permanent settlement happened in Bengal. And the permanent settlement is when, sorry, I don't want to like give like a whole history lesson,
No, no,
but
this is so interesting. Keep going.
so the permanent settlement in Bengal, when the East India Company, they're essentially the British, got to Bengal, they were first allowed to collect taxes as sort of emissaries of the Mughal Empire, and so in 1757, what happened is they started enacting this thing called the permanent settlement, which is a bunch of sort of legislation that got put together for them to become one, to permanently settle in Bengal, so they weren't sort of like temporary settlers, and two, to collect taxes in mass, which is sort of the first step in sort of mass colonization that happened. And I'm essentializing a bit. There are some like more details to it, obviously, but I think and so the point that I'm trying to get at is that that period that I'm covering, in referencing the sort of work around archive that historians often do, uh, a lot of those archives are decimated. Like they're, colonial presence destroyed a lot of that stuff, especially indigenous sort of Muslim thought and movement and materials. And being in a religious study space, it lets me be a little bit more creative and how I structure my argument and how I would do my work. That isn't to say I don't use proof and archives and all of these things, or textual evidence and all of that. And also, big disclaimer: I am a first year PhD, so a lot of this research has not happened yet. But inshallah, we'll see where it
Inshallah.
goes. But yeah, so I think the religious studies discipline allows me a little bit more breadth in terms of what tools I can use, um, than maybe a history department would.
Like for those of us unfamiliar with the history, right? Kind of like segue us into like what was, let's say, the predominant religion and culture, and what kind of empires were there at that time.
How Islam kind of came. So, okay, Bengal is a region historically, if you're going before the rise of Islam, um, was religiously speaking, whatever that means, was mostly Buddhist. And the empires that existed before the Bengal Sultanate, which was the first Muslim cohesive empire that existed in Bengal, uh, where they were all Buddhist. And so the sort of how that conversion or sort of like move shift into a Muslim Bengal is largely contested history. There's like a lot of sort of different ideas about how that came about. Richard Eaton at University of Arizona wrote a really good book about it. It's called The Rise of Islam on the Bengal Frontier. Um, and there's a lot of different sort of narratives about how that came about. Uh, there was a lot of trade happening in the southern parts of Bengal, so areas like where I'm from in Chittagong, were engaging in a lot of trade with the Arab empires. And then there was a lot of migration of Sufis in the northern parts of Bengal, particularly Sylhet. Um, and so both of those sort of coalesced into a larger and larger Muslim presence until the uh, kind of rise of the Bengal Sultanate, which was I think in the 13th century. Um, I don't have the dates in front of me, but yeah, something like that. With Ilyas Shah, who created the first, sort of, who was the head of the first Bengal Sultanate, and then around uh, later on, when the Mughals sort of came to power, they absorbed the Bengal Sultanate, and that Sultanate became an arm of the Mughal Empire. Um, Very often touted as the sort of crown of the Mughal Empire. They were an economic hub as well as a political and social hub. Um, a large part of the sort of like import exports that were happening and agriculture and things like that. Actually, this is so like during the Mughal Empire is when Bengal started to become more of an agricultural hub, which is like really interesting. Particularly because this also shaped how Islamic cosmology sort of was shaped in Bengal. There was obviously, I think, throughout this whole period, it wasn't just Muslims in Bengal, and so for that reason, Bengal also is an interesting place where there are Hindus there, there are still Buddhists there. There's a lot of other things, other non-Muslims that are there, and I think that shaped Muslim cosmology in like a very interesting way. Another person that wrote like a good work about that is Aisha Arani, who's at UMass, wrote about um, Sayyid Sultan, who was the Sufi that existed. He was in Bengal around the 15th or 16th century, I think. Um, he was a Sufi. He worked on this thing called the Qisas Nabiya, which is a genre of literature that has existed in sort of Islamic context forever. The Qisas Nabiya is basically stories of the prophets. Starts from Adam alayhi salam to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But what's interesting about sort of Sayyid Sultan's work is that in the 15th century, although and this was a common thing that was done, he would, in that cosmology of like prophets, he would try and he would talk about Hindu gods and things like that and bring them in as sort of prophetic figures or whatever, while still constructing a sense of Muslim community where he's saying like we are Muslim and this is, like Tawheed and all of these things versus this is not what is a Muslim practice. So I think like um sorry, I know I'm like going from thing to thing, but I think like
Yeah.
within the context of the Mughal Empire, to bring it all back, with the sort of like rise of agricultural, the rise of the agricultural importance of Bengal, uh, you have a sort of very interesting Muslim imaginary that's forming in Bengal that factors into kind of the later work that I'm doing, which I'll go get more into later, but inshallah. But yeah, that's I don't remember what your original question was,
Yeah, no,
but
no.
there's a lot there.
No,
Yeah,
that was good. That was good because I think you took us through like basically almost like pre-Islam, what kind of the area of Bengal was like, and then all the kind of empires and nations and the changes in leadership and
yeah,
shifts in culture, right? So I guess, and you already touched on basically how the British Empire kind of was introduced to that area and how they
hmm
kind of began that colonialization
yeah.
process. So I think that's kind of where you left off last. So they started the taxation. So let's pick up
Yeah.
there.
So I think this is kind of the more tragic part of Bengali history. I think so um right before the permanent settlement was the Bengali Nawab, which is for the Nawab is sort of like, if you think about it, is essentially the same thing as a sultanate, but it's the Nawabs of Bengal were, the main difference is that they were Shia, and they were still connected to the Mughal Empire, but they were kind of their own thing. Um, yeah, and so the Nawabs of Bengal, the tragic aspect of it is that there was a lot of infighting and betrayal that happened with the Nawabs, which is ultimately what led to the collapse of Bengal, in the sense of leaving an opening for the East India Company to kind of take over. The last Nawab was betrayed by one of his military advisors. I think the top military advisor, uh, and he was betrayed. Basically, the East India Company convinced him to betray the Nawab in order to, at the Battle of Plassey, which is what happened in 1757. It was a defeat of the Bengal Nawab at the hands of the East India Company. And after that defeat, the East India Company assumed control of Bengal. Um, and that is the real beginning of colonization of not just Bengal, but I would argue largely it's the beginning of the collapse of the Mughal Empire and the sort of like beginning of large scale colonization of South Asia.
So yeah, I think the very similar tactic to what they used for many of their other colonies around the world,
Yeah,
right?
so you could all like you could say that the theories of colonization, or rather the practices of colonization, were tested out in by the East India Company in South Asia.
Oh wow.
So while this was happening in Bengal, there was also destabilization efforts happening by the East India Company in South India and other parts of India, that I can't remember right now, but but other sort of larger states in India that were destabilizing kind of the same way by the British in order to do a mass takeover of South Asia. This sort of divide and conquer strategy
Right.
is starting around this time,
Right. Right. Right.
which is a
Well,
term coined by the British. Divide and conquer is actually, if you look it up, it is like a term coined by uh I don't want to say the British Raj, but maybe like the British Empire at that time.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's interesting. So you mentioned the Mughal Empire. I know, like, just trying to link this to the greater, Muslim Ummah.
Sure.
Like, so you have the Ottoman Empire that also exists
hmm
at this
hmm
time, right? So what was that kind of relationship like? Were these two completely different caliphates, like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
concurrently, or?
Yeah, I mean, take what I say with a grain of salt, because I am not an Ottomanist, but from my understanding, yeah, the collapse of the Mughal Empire left a real hole for South Asian Muslims, largely speaking, and a lot of what, again, like essentializing a little bit, excuse me, essentializing a little bit, one after the collapse of the Mughal Empire, a lot of those South Asian Muslims turned to the Ottoman Empire as a sort of, as what they would look at in terms of, you know uh, a Muslim empire, like where they would turn for authority.
Mhm.
um So this is an interesting time, right? I think, like, largely speaking, this is when a lot of people talk about this idea of Muslim decline starting,
Okay.
which is 18th century, 19th century, where you have the collapse of the Mughals, and then 100 years later, you start to see the collapse of the Ottomans, and you have the rise of colonialism in, like, a really intense way, not just in South Asia, but also in North Africa and West Africa, and responses in different ways. And then you start also seeing this sort of rise in this idea of what is now referred to as Islamic revivalism, both with um, the Wahhabist movement in Saudi, but also the movements that are happening in South Asia as well. Um, and I think that as the Mughals kind of collapse and these things happen, this question of Muslim decline or Islamic decline is really interesting because, you know, a lot of what Western narratives talk about is that this idea of Muslim society decline, but a lot of, economic progress is still happening, a lot of technological innovation, all of these things. Society and, like, these societies still largely existed. The Ottomans existed for like another 150 years. The Mughals really only died out at the beginning of the 18th century, so there was still like a robust sort of network of intelligence and things like that. And economic, it wasn't an economic decline by any means for at least 100 years,
Hmm.
and so you have different things happening at this time that kind of contest with this idea of Muslim decline. And to answer your question, yeah, I think there is there's two important questions to ask here. One, was there a Muslim decline, as I was talking about? And two, thinking about the Mughals, thinking about Ottomans and things like that, how did Muslims kind of see themselves as an ummah at this time? Did they see themselves as a connected ummah? Did they see themselves, even if you think about things that we take for granted now, like Hajj? Hajj was you could imagine Hajj completely differently back then because there wasn't as much. The steamship hadn't been invented. Sea travel wasn't Hajj was a much more arduous journey,
Right. Right.
and so that sort of like Muslim metropole that we think of now as like all of us meeting at Hajj and this sort of cultural diffusion that happens there, you can imagine it completely differently back then, right? Um, Not to say that that cultural diffusion didn't happen there, but it's a completely different time, and so I don't have a definitive answer for how like Muslims saw themselves, but there's a
Yeah.
lot of complicated things that are happening at the time.
I think you just made such a spectacular point there. Just the the day and age that we live in with globalization and the I guess the ease of spread of ideas, and then obviously, like you mentioned, like physically traveling and being able to be exposed to so many different people and perspectives and concepts. Right? It's almost like you know. I'd be curious to see like how that affects the like almost like the general outlook of people, right? Are now people more connected, or are they more able to sympathize with each other, or the opposite could happen, right? It could make people more divisive, right? Just by seeing all those things and finding areas to disagree upon. So I'd be curious to see what your thoughts on that might be.
You mean like in like contemporary sort of like times, or like?
Yeah, yeah, and just if you were to compare, like, just because of modern technology, right? If you were to
Yeah,
compare, like, let's say even like 100 years ago to what it is now, right? So
totally. I mean, I think it's a complex question, man. I think in some ways we're more connected, in some ways we're less
right,
connected.
absolutely,
I think it's, and in some ways the more connected we get, the less connected we actually are in reality. Like
that's deep.
those connections that we actually make are not, substantial in the way that they used to be, right?
Yeah,
It's tough, man. I think that, you know, as Muslims there is a responsibility that we have of forging meaningful connections, not
yeah,
necessarily like a ton of like, we don't need like a huge network and all of these things,
yeah,
but I think, there is an ethic, there is an adab that we have to have when we're thinking about
right,
how we connect with people,
right,
right? And I
right,
think like that adab existed in the same way 100 years ago.
yeah,
I think like when you see pictures and when you see like any sort of documents about there's like letters that people would write to each other back then, where you see like intellectual and social discourse happening, where it was there was a respect there that I think is really interesting to think about.
Yeah.
And I think like a lot of what's happening now is, what is the purpose in like how we talk to each other? What is the sort of etiquette that we have with each other, and sort of, how do we are we being as kind to each other as we should be?
Yeah, yeah, no, these are great questions. I think it's something that, everyone can reflect upon and really see, I guess how you can better yourself. Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, absolutely, man. I think like that's one of the things that was really interesting to me about when I first started thinking about Islamic studies and kind of like the stuff that I wanted to study. Because part of it was also, the first thing I worked on was the Fizi movement, which is it's this anti-colonial movement that happened. It's like the tail end of what I'm studying. So it happened around like the 1820s in Bengal,
Mhm.
around like Faridpur, like Mymensingh area in like in Bangladesh, what
Right.
is now Bangladesh. Um, and so coming up in New York, a lot of sort of my sensibilities were, I grew up working class in New York. My dad was working class, like, he owned a small business, and you know, um, and so those sensibilities are really important to me. When I was coming out of like undergrad, a lot of the things that were important to me were questions about labor and sort of, class consciousness, and how do you transcend sort of the the way that our society very often prioritizes wealth over self-worth, or how we are very often seen as just how productive can we be. That's the bottom line of your value as a person in society a lot of the time. The Farazi movement was an anti-colonial movement and an Islamic revivalist movement, quote unquote, but it was also one of the sort of earlier labor movements. Um, and a lot of what I found really interesting about it, is that the basis of that movement was that it was Islamic revivalism tied to labor. So it was this idea that the British Empire did not have a right to the land in Bengal because they did not work it, and they were not farmers on it. And so from an Islamic worldview, it called back to certain rights within both the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire of how land rights worked. And it basically disqualified British rule on an Islamic basis. And I thought that was really interesting, because I think uh, there's a really long legacy of Bengalis as sort of champions of both like labor and agriculture, and within that Islamic context, it's really important to think about that, because very in sort of like in contemporary Bengali discourse, a lot of that time that Islamic aspect is lost or sort of like forgotten about.
Yeah.
But it played a large part in sort of who Bengalis have come to be, in sort of in modern times. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I think that resonates with me just because I guess being part of like the Bengali diaspora, like you lose a lot of um I don't want to call it like pride, but almost like, sense of like,
like
that's
where you come from.
yeah, and it's like, oh yeah, yeah, you should be known for doing like whatever these things are important to you, or these
Yeah,
things are, like are yeah, like kind of like values that you hold or things like that. So
absolutely.
I think like hearing stories like that is important, right? Just to kind of instill that kind of like, just like uh yeah, I guess for lack of a better word, like pride, just of
Yeah,
like you know what, this is like, as a Bengali, um um this is kind of what we're known for, this is what we should live for. And I feel like you see that in like maybe some other ethnicities, right?
sure.
That they kind of wear that on their sleeves, like, oh, like X, Y, and Z.
Yeah,
And maybe I'm just disconnected a little bit, or maybe, like it just needs to be like reiterated more on just like things that
yeah.
historically yeah.
Absolutely, and yeah, I see where you're coming from 100% with that. I think this is also this there is this sort of like Muslim inferiority complex that arises a lot of the time, and I think it's important. A lot of the important aspects of scholarship, like that, you know. Muslim scholars are engaged in, and I think is what's really important, and a lot of sort of what my colleagues think about, and a lot of stuff that we talk about very often, like when we get together for coffee or something like that, is you know there historically, like, this idea of like Muslim inferiority is also part of the colonial project a lot of the time, right? Uh, Post 1857, post rebellion, and post sort of the consolidation of British power in India, one of the major destabilizing projects was uh, the, there were a couple of universities that came about in the wake of that. One of them is Aligarh University, um, which I think was started by Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. I think that was his name. It basically, that project, he Aligarh University started to emphasize that Muslims should engage with English and should engage with Western Academy and should engage with the West in a way. I hesitate to use the term the West, but it should engage with the West in a way where naturally it kind of landed into this idea of like Muslim empire hasn't worked. We aren't good enough, so we need to sort of engage in this Muslim apologetic discourse.
Wow.
Um, and I think there's remnants of that now. I think a lot of the work that I look at is, again, I'm in my first year. I haven't been able to prove a lot of this stuff yet, I will say, but I think a lot of the evidence is there where the Muslim society was very robust, and this idea of Muslim inferiority or this Muslim apologetic discourse is not well founded. And I think this thing where you're talking about the diaspora and feeling disconnected from where you come from, or not necessarily feeling a sense of pride about where you come from. uh I mean, man, like, look at where we're at, right? Like, look at how Muslims are talked about in the media. Look at how we're talked about, largely speaking, how we've been talked about over the last several decades.
Right.
Um, I think it it makes sense that that sense of disconnection. Um, it's very important to feel pride as a Bengali Muslim, in the same way that it's very important to feel pride as a West African, a Senegalese Muslim, or a British Muslim, or whatever, because I think it's important to know that those histories, we all played a part in this sort of like larger Muslim empire and Muslim ummah and Muslim discourse. Um, and a lot of that has been wiped out, and so I think like that idea of feeling disconnected is so universal sometimes, because you talk to you talk to Muslims who are coming from other sort of colonial legacies, and they all say the same thing. They're like, yeah, my parents were there, and now I'm here, and I'm made to feel different because of like, I don't really feel connected to that Muslim history. I don't really feel connected to what I come from, and
Yeah.
these like discourses that I was attached to.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. So what do you think is like a part of the solution for that? It's just first and foremost, I'm looking forward to hearing your research and your findings, right? But inshallah, may Allah give you
Inshallah,
tawfiq
inshallah, inshallah, inshallah.
with all of that effort. But with that being said, I think what do you think is like I don't want to say solution, but like a remedy to some of that feeling of disconnection and
I will say that one of the reasons that I went into Islamic studies in Western academia is because I do not feel that I have the spiritual wherewithal to be an imam or a sheikh or any of that.
right.
But and mashallah to those who pursue that path. Which is to say that I don't feel authorized to give an answer there. But
Yeah.
I think that it's important to know our histories. I think that, so there's a lot of conversations about decolonization that happen, and about how do we decolonize our minds and all of these things. The two biggest things is, one, learning the language of the people you come from. So for Bengalis, it's important to know Bengali. I would say it's important to know Bangla, uh, and two, to know your history. I think even in the 20th century, pause.
Yeah,
we
mashallah. What do you think? Like, would you consider like permanently relocating out there?
No, I definitely want to come back. No, I think it's different things for different people. I have a cousin that moved down there who
Uh-huh.
like would never leave.
Yeah,
Like loves it, loves the space,
yeah,
he loves the community and all that.
yeah,
I think it's nice, man. I think North Carolina has a really beautiful community and a lot of really nice history there.
yeah,
But I miss New York. My family's up here.
yeah,
A lot of my friends are up here, and the conversations you have in New York are really hard. Like they're, you can't have them anywhere else a lot of the time.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I love New York. I if it's in the cards, inshallah, you know what I'm saying?
Inshallah.
I think the other thing that's important to know about academia is for anyone who may be considering getting into it is that you are at the mercy of where you can get a job,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
jobs are very scarce. So, if I end up back I would take anywhere in the Northeast, to be honest with you. But, inshallah, we'll see where Allah takes me.
So the plan is you want to be like a professor, like full time?
Yeah, that's the idea. I've done the 9 to 5 life. It's not for me,
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely, inshallah,
Inshallah.
that would be the goal.
Yeah, yeah. That's pretty sweet. That's pretty sweet. Yeah, yeah. We need more of those. We need good
Yeah,
professors
inshallah.
everywhere. So
Inshallah,
you know what's
man.
crazy? Like when I think about it, like now I have a lot of friends or people that I know that are like public school teachers, right?
Right.
And now like I'm getting to the age where I have friends that are like professors, which is like crazy
That's wild to
because
think about.
like there was when you're growing up, you see your teachers and you're like, oh, look at these old people,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
then you reach that age where like, oh, like those old people were my age and they're just like regular
That's
people, right?
right.
And now like I see professors where like I would see professors and be like, look at these old like, oh, you're a professor, but now
Yeah.
it's like, oh, I kind
Yeah,
of
when you're
know.
18 and when you're 30, whatever, it's
Yeah,
a much different experience.
exactly, exactly. It's so interesting. It's
I
like
I had I had the same vibe when I was like thinking about when I saw doctors, like my friends who were like finishing up their residencies, and I'm
right.
like, these guys were idiots in high school. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if I trust them aside. And now I see myself as an academic, and I'm like, oh yeah, nobody knows anything, bro.
Exactly. That's like the craziest thing. Like everyone's just figuring out life. Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
like even like one of those things like I think I saw like clearly I spent too much time on social media, but there's like a
yeah.
meme where it's like, oh yeah, like be easy on your parents because this is their first time living too.
That's right.
Right? And it's deep
Yeah,
because like you always
subhanallah,
you
yeah.
look at your parents, it's like, yo, listen, you're like an adult, like you should know
Yeah.
this. But it's like, no, because I'm an adult too, and I don't know it. So it's
Yeah,
like
absolutely. And I mean, you
it's deep,
think of our parents too. A lot of our parents are immigrants,
right?
and it's like not only is it their first time doing it, living their lives, they're doing it in a completely unknown context without their families. Think of how like we're both Bengali, and
Yeah,
like having kids in Bangladesh
yeah.
when our parents were coming up is a much different experience than us having kids now. You know what I'm
You
saying?
got to give heavy props because like think about it, like if you and my because like our parents probably immigrated around the same age that we are right
Right,
now, right?
right,
So you transplant me to China right now and be like,
exactly.
okay,
Just make a life
make
for
it. Yeah,
yourself. Like
that's kind of crazy.
it's
That's like
wild. It's wild.
yeah. So I big props. Like sometimes I'm like, yeah, why don't you get it? Like this is so something. Like nah, you grew up here.
Absolutely.
Like for like it's not the same.
Yeah.
So and yeah, like yeah, it's
You
just
gotta give your parents grace. You gotta give your parents
absolutely,
grace.
absolutely.
Nobody has it easy, man. Alhamdulillah. I think like
Alhamdulillah.
we were talking a little bit earlier about why I do this or what the significance of like the things that I study are. I think in the same way that yeah. Oh, you didn't get any of that? That was gold.
Yeah, no, bro, you should have been recording. You record always.
Well, you got
Just
the
record.
audio. You got the audio at
Yeah,
least.
and I recorded over here. Like
Okay.
always, just record, just no matter what. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I think earlier we were talking about how like what is the significance or like why I'm studying what I'm studying, and like how is it significant for folks nowadays, but more specifically Muslims, but generally for people, for anyone. Um, I think that it's really important to know that in a in an age where very often we are concerned about justice and we're concerned about ethics and we're concerned about right and wrong, these issues and the stakes of those issues come up repeatedly during history. And we also live in an age where that history is very often used as a weapon against these ideas of justice and these ideas of ethics and who we are and our place in the universe, and or our place in the world rather. But I think the work that I'm looking at, why it's important to me is because I think it's just one very like minute example of folks who had a strong sense of justice, who had a strong ethic, and were not going to stand a for what they thought was injustice, and whatever that may be, whatever shape that may take. And for me as a Bengali Muslim, like, it's important to see that in my own people and my own culture. But I think it's important for everyone to know that those examples exist everywhere historically, and um, that's why I think it's really important to think about history, and that's why I think I started studying it and I started working on it, because I want to carve out a little bit more evidence for that historical example of justice and ethics.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think those are great points, and I actually wanted to ask you this question before we started. So throughout your studies, all the research you've done, you've seen, you've read through history, and like they say, history often repeats itself, right? So what are some of those key takeaways that we, lessons learned that we could take from history and kind of apply it to today? This the times that we're living in, whether they be politics or just just in life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one, don't be apathetic. I think there is a sense of apathy that kind of persists a lot of the time, because it seems that things are insurmountable, that things are inevitable, or that they feel so inevitably bad, that how will we ever overcome? I think the very often when we think about history repeating itself, we think about the events that are bad or that have negative consequences. But we also need to remember that history repeats itself in people overcoming those negative circumstances and overcoming those negative consequences. I think that I went to there was a talk at UNC a couple of like a week or two ago by Cornell West, and he was talking about pessimism and sort of this idea of how like there's this idea of pessimism that has been persistent in history. And the idea is that it's not that folks like Malcolm Malcolm X were not pessimistic. The pessimism was definitely there, but the the strive to overcome, and the sort of the adherence to the idea that goodness will overcome and will be at the forefront of what they do, that was way more important to them than that pessimism and that sort of apathy. And yeah, I think that we need to remember that not only the bad history repeats itself, but also the good history.
That's deep. I like that. We're gonna clip that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's just clip just that. No other parts of the interview do I want released. Just that one.
That's too good. That's too good. I think we touched on a lot of good topics. I think we got a lot of good ideas out there. In case anyone wants to reach out to you afterwards, they want to learn more or just have any questions, how can they find you?
Yeah, just email me. My email should be listed both on the description of this video. It's really simple. It's just shamim@unc.edu. Yeah, please feel free to shoot me a line. I'm happy to talk to anyone.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Shamim, for coming to the
Thank you,
podcast.
man. This was great.
Absolutely, absolutely. Hope to have you again in the future.
Inshallah,
And
inshallah.
inshallah, inshallah. So, if you guys enjoyed that, like, subscribe. If you have any comments, please leave it in the comments section below, and we'll see you on the next one. Alrighty.